welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always is my fabulous co-host.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Diana Perry Cruz.
And it's me, Jackie.
Jackie only has one name, like a superstar.
Or like Jackie.
Jackie. I wish that was my name for reals, but it's not.
Jackie.
Jackie.
Yeah. Do I always said "and my fabulous co-host" and used singular?
No, you say plural.
Oh, I said singular that time.
You can't tell. It's like ghostesses.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's okay. I don't mind.
Hostesses.
Okay, but this isn't a grammar podcast. This is a podcast about behavior. No, I don't. Behavior analysis and behavior analytic practice, where every week we pick a topic and discuss relevant research articles. And this week is a listener choice episode where our patrons get to vote on a number of topics. And the winner of our topic of choice was a tutorial type episode. This was sort of based on a couple articles we found that were very procedure based. And we said, let's just talk about these in the context of tutorials, how to do the skills that are in these articles. And we'll bring our own additional levels of know-how, whatever know-how we got, we'll add that, stir it together, make a little podcast. Originally, we were going to talk about two topics, but because we found some other articles, or Diana found some other articles she wanted to share, we're going to break this up. So we have our winter listener choice, which is going to be what we do today on procedural fidelity. And then we'll come back and do part 2 and talk about token economies in our spring listener choice episode, which I think will be in like April or May. So it's still a little bit of a ways away. So don't worry, though.
New England spring.
So it's all coming. You're going to get it all. And if you are a patron at the $5 and up level, not only did you get to pick this topic, but you have your choice of watching our full unedited video outtake version. Well, the outtakes are there. They're intakes in that case. And whether you listen to the video or watch the video or listen to the podcast that comes out, you will get a code to get a free CE. So if you are saying, oh, Patreon, I wish I could have voted, there's an extra bonus. Oh, I wish I could get a CE for free. And I wish I could watch whatever garbage they do before and after the recording and all the bloopers within the recording. Well, that would be how? Patreon.com/ABA Inside Track.
All the faces.
We're on Zoom, so this video is going to be a little wonky. We're not, on Zencaster, because in any minute now, as of this recording, it is going to snow 8 inches of snow. We don't know when.
One fell swoop.
It's just going to drop on us. Yep.
Yeah.
It's
That's
a big
some good podcast audio right there, Dan. Just spit right into the mic.
You know, when I moved to New England, just to go back, someone told me, oh, wow, you're going to love the spring. In April, the leaves come back. And then in May, the flowers come back. And I was like, that's terrible. That can't possibly be true. But it is true. Yeah. Because you kind of think that, you think of like, what is it? In March, in like a lion, out like a lamb? No, not here. In like a lion, out like a lion. April is also in like a lion, out like a small lion, and then finally May.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Anyway, procedural fidelity or procedural integrity, however you want to talk about it.
Segue.
This is our tutorial episode, and we have 3 articles that we'll be discussing to lay out what makes good procedural fidelity and how you too can procedural fidelity.
Yeah, so before, if you listen to the preview episode, we had said, oh, we're going to do 2 topics in this tutorial format. And we still are.
I already did that part.
I know, but I'm just elaborate. I just want to.
Okay.
I checked out for that, and so now it's my turn.
You're like,
you
got to think of that great in like a lion, out like a lion.
No, that was off the cuff.
Okay.
But since they're 2 really important topics, right? Like, how do we actually do procedural integrity? How do we actually do token economy setup? And so I felt like they each warranted their own episode, given that the only thing holding them together really was that we were going to talk about them in terms of how do you actually get this stuff up and running, right? So like a tutorial format. So my hope and dream is that we can make this a long running like mini series within the episodes that we produce. So a tutorial format episode is one that, just like how we do listener choice sometimes and grab bag sometimes, tutorial can now become like a subcategory within the episodes that we release. And the intention here is that what we tell you about is research backed, but it's very practice oriented.
Great.
That's it.
And how are we going to do that practice-oriented discussion today?
Why, by talking about 3 articles, of course. Let me tell you what they are. Do you want the meat and potatoes article first?
Whatever order you desire.
Okay, the article that started it all, in terms of us wanting to do this episode, or Rob wanting to do this episode, is this one.
Don't tell them, because then everyone knows that they voted for the Rob episode.
It was a Rob episode.
Which they usually do.
Yeah, they usually
my
do.
choices are great.
Seem to have your pulse on what the people want. Whereas no one ever picks anything that I want. But that's okay. I'm original. I'm like one of those snowflakes that's going to 8 inches of them that's going to fall outside.
Oh.
You want to hear the article?
Yeah, I do want to hear the article.
Okay, it's called A Practitioner's Guide to Measuring Procedural Fidelity by Morris, Jones, and Oliveira. And that was in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2024.
Guys, a friend of the pod,
Friend
Morris.
of the pod, Cody Morris. Hi, Cody. We're going to gravy that up with 2 other articles. One is titled A Survey of Procedural Fidelity Data Collection in Behavior Analytic Practice by Bergman, Harmon, Brand, and Vladescu. Hi, Jason. Friend of the pod. And that was in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2024. And finally, a brief evaluation of a pictorially enhanced self-instruction packet on participant fidelity across multiple ABA procedures by Al Nasser, Williams, and Feeney. And that was in Behavioral Analysis and Practice 2019.
Beautiful.
Get ready.
Beautiful. All right. Well, let's get it. Let's kick it off by talking a little bit about procedural fidelity, procedural integrity. We're going to use them interchangeably. The authors do as well. And let's talk a little bit about why this is important before we get into the how you will create procedural fidelity systems. And even if you're saying, I know how to make a procedural fidelity system, I make the best ones. It is possible you do exactly what is recommended in Morris and all.
You do not.
But more likely, you do what a lot of us do, which is the majority of the things in Morris et al., and then you miss like 2 or 3 various points. And when you hear them, you'll say, oh my goodness, that is the best idea. Why wasn't I already doing that? Which is what I did when I read that article, which is always fun. I like an art, you know, when you read an article and you're like, I already know about like 70% of the, like you're almost at mastery, but not quite. And then you read the article and it fills in that last 20 to 30%. And you're like, now I understand this topic super thoroughly. Those are the best.
You understand it, but can you implement it?
I don't know. Who knows? That's why I do a podcast where I just have to talk about it. No one will know.
Actually, you're a very good practitioner as well.
Stop.
Yeah. That's the word on the street.
I don't appreciate this slander.
So, I called this a gravy article, but it's coming before the meat and potatoes article. So I think this is probably like a salad article.
It's a
appetizer.
Amuse-bouche.
Amuse-bouche. Yes. And we're going to an appetizer article. Yeah.
The jalapeno poppers of this episode.
Oh, for sure it is. And given that, we're just going to snack on it. I'm not going to spend a long time because this is really just to sort of lay some groundwork in terms of how much are people using procedural fidelity out there? What are the current practices, etc. So I'm going to get through this relatively quickly. To make sure that we know what and I'm going to try to use procedural fidelity. I know you say that they're interchangeable, but I think of procedural integrity as being largely related to research and procedural fidelity being largely related to on-the-floor intervention practices. And maybe that is a false dichotomy that I've set up there, but generally in the literature, that's how I have come to understand.
We get it. You're very smart and you do research, Diana. Everybody is very impressed.
Well, I might not be right, but
I haven't heard that distinction. I've heard them that they're synonymous, but that you could be right.
They are.
Diana's an elitist and she wants to have 2 separate terms. Go on.
No. Maybe there's not a distinction and maybe people will write in and tell me that.
I like your story. The idea of fidelity being doing something correctly because it's very important to use our procedures to help
fidelity,
our clients correctly
fiduciary
every time.
Bank.
Whereas integrity has to do with the idea of, you need to have that internal validity in your studies. I think that sounds fair, though I don't know if I will go out of my way to always try to use one or the other.
Okay.
But maybe I will now.
I'm
That's a good story.
For procedural fidelity here in this convo. But both of them, independent of my distinction I tried to make on setting, both of them really have the same meaning, which is how well someone or someones are adhering to a set of protocols that has been established already. So I've told you what to do, and now how well do you do it, right? This is something that's important because, as you already referenced, Rob, it as a way for us to check on the internal validity of any given, we'll just say intervention, right? Because that kind of covers everything. If you're not doing what is written down on paper, then you don't know if the changes that you're seeing are due to the thing that you're doing or due to outside variables. And so if you've been kind of wishy-washy and loosey-goosey in your approach, you won't then be able to identify if a change was made, if it was due specifically to your intervention because you didn't follow it properly, or if a change wasn't made, if it was due to some issue that you had with your intervention following intervention protocol, I guess. So it's important for us to check on that. We should be using procedural fidelity in our decision making as BCBAs. This is what Bergman and colleagues want to make sure that we know. And in doing so, it will help us understand if a client's not making progress, why that could be the case, right? So it could be that there are errors in the implementation of a behavior plan or an academic teaching plan. And I really like thinking about behavior analysts as detectives and problem solvers, right? I think that we spend a lot of time in our field talking about how we might reduce challenging behavior, but I think that we also have a unique viewpoint and skill set in detecting problems that may be present in terms of the overall implementation of teaching strategies, whether that be for increase or decrease of behavior, right? And so this is one of those hidden components. When you have an issue with procedural fidelity, you might not, it's definitely not the first thing you think of, right? You think about everything else, but it could be that that's one of the pieces that's preventing progress from being made. So I love the idea of getting in there and looking at this from that like detective perspective.
So I think that's interesting, Diana, because from my own professional perspective, typically procedural fidelity is my number one go-to assumption when something doesn't seem to be, some treatment doesn't seem to be leading to the outcome I'm looking for.
Oh, yeah?
And I'm not sure if that has more to do with when you're practicing in a variety of settings, you're often dealing with lots and lots of different staff members. So when it comes down to where is the failure in the treatment, and I hope this doesn't sound too
pessimistic.
No, I want to say egotistical in terms of, well, the problem is probably not me and my brilliant treatment. It's probably the number of people who I know never get as much training and support as we want them to get and all the turnover. So it's probably a failure with how the treatment is being implemented. Now, I often will try to look at that more from also a standpoint of training oversight. It is a lot easier to ensure better procedural fidelity than it is to go back, do another assessment, do another treatment, keep changing my treatment, then looking. Because there's definitely a chance that the more I change in a treatment, I'm definitely going to see a decrease in procedural fidelity because I'm still dealing with a lot of the same environmental variables, not enough time for observation, not enough time to support staff, not enough training for staff in some of the basic principles, meaning you require a lot more kind of simplified procedures depending on the setting you're in. So again, that's not meant to demean or to put down any group in our treatment programs. However, that tends to be sort of the easiest thing to check on. Like if you can't set up good procedural fidelity checks, then you're going to get very few places. You're not going to get very far. Like that should always be your number one. Like, well, because if that's broken, it doesn't matter how good or bad your treatment is, right? You have to make sure that's in place.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't think we do a good job as behavior analysts in all places having procedural and fidelity in place, right? So I teach an AV supervision class, right? And when I talk about procedural fidelity and when we talk about how to set it up, and I survey the class, how many of you have supervisors that have set these checks up in place? There's actually very few, surprisingly, that will say that they have experienced this. And they also often get it confused with IOA. They're like, oh yeah, we're taking data together. I'm like, well, no, right? Mm-hmm. That is not the same. That's a different, you're Great looking point. At a completely different behavior there. So I do want to point that out for listeners that may be new to procedural fidelity or treatment integrity, is that IOA is looking at the student response, not the treatment. So you're looking at, did the staff record what you thought they should record and not like what they did, right?
But could you do IOA of procedural fidelity?
Yes, you could do IOA of procedural fidelity, right? Because you're looking at whether
That's my favorite. That's my favorite supervision activity.
But nobody ever does that. So I do want to point out that yes, I think procedural fidelity is critical, right? It is critical. It is something that we should all be doing, but I don't think it is. And it's no fault for BCBAs, right? Because there isn't, if you are working in a situation where you are insurance-based, right? Or you're funded outside and you have to mark what you're doing, it is rare that there is a code for procedural fidelity, right? So it's just hard you can do it and there are ways to do it, but it's just harder to fit it in.
So not to jump too far ahead, but Dinah, why does it even matter if we're doing procedural fidelity? Who cares? You're great. I make great treatments. You make great treatments. I'm sure it's going to all work out fine in the wash and everyone's going to be happy, right?
Yeah. So I can tell you that it is important to check because historically, when other folks have looked at it, they found that it's not been the case, that there's been high levels of procedural fidelity in implementation of various treatment packages. So Carroll et al. 2013, which I know, Rob, you're going to reference in the Morris article as well, found that depending on the teaching program, there was 21 to 74% fidelity, which is not 100% for sure. And that can be problematic. That can impact learning, which is another study that we're not going to talk about today. We can save that for another time. So conducting procedural fidelity can tell us if a program is being implemented correctly, which then can clue us in about both skill acquisition, whether we see it or don't see it. And the other piece too, I think is important here is it's not only about skill acquisition to me, it's about, is the program that is being asked or the intervention that's being asked to be implemented actually feasible to be done in the way that you're asking it, right? So it can be a check on the behavior analysts as well in terms of what they're writing. And I think that is not a piece that should be overlooked because you can write really fantastical things that it would be virtually impossible for someone to implement with fidelity. And we should be looking carefully at whether what we're asking someone to do is possible, given all of the things that people are being asked to do. Mm-hmm. So I think that is another way to think about procedural integrity as a check on your own behavior.
Yeah. So when we look at procedural integrity and the way we're kind of going to define it throughout, it is going to be the idea that you are directly observing someone engaging in your evidence-based practice, evidence-based treatment program, and identifying whether or not the components of that treatment plan are being implemented correctly. Typically, what you'll see are going to be errors of either commission or omission. Errors of omission would be, all right, everybody, this is how you do your discrete trial intervention. And the person is just sort of skipping steps of it. Whoops, they don't get attention. Whoops, I didn't put out any stimuli. That's my bad. Whoops, I didn't deliver any reinforcement following the correct response. So that would be one type of error. And then commission is going to be, I added in a bunch of little steps that I thought would give it some zazz. And it's like, nope, those steps are irrelevant and don't need to be in there and are potentially confusing the learner as to what's the relevant stimuli that they should be attending to. So again, there's going to be commission errors. And there's some research to support that, different errors are going to lead to different patterns of problems. So like St. Peter Pipkin has an article talking about commission errors really make it hard for treatments around, decreasing problem behavior to be as effective. And then Carroll, who Dinah, you already kind of mentioned, says omission errors often slow the rate of acquisition, but commission errors sometimes don't have that effect. Who knows? So there's something going on. So any type of error is going to have some amount of impact. How much, what kind, and what direction, are you looking for your, rates to go up or down? That's a little wishy-washy. It's probably somewhat idiosyncratic. But what matters is making errors leads to worse outcomes. How worse? I don't think that's a question we want to spend a lot of time quantifying, is it? I think we'd rather say, if it's any worse, it's too worse. Let's make it better.
Yeah. So all that to say, it is important to take procedural fidelity data and try to fix issues if you see them happening. I know this is something that falls to the back burner a lot, but perhaps there are ways to build this into your regularly scheduled programming such that they're not taking in a lot of extra time for you. I'm going to run you down some stats real fast, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about the big article. So in the Bergman study, they interviewed 200 behavior analysts via survey, and they got the following statistics back. 89% of them, they were all BCBAs, said they got some amount of training on procedural fidelity. And when they were asked what type of procedural fidelity they did, 99% of them said that they collected it via direct assessment methods, meaning they watched something happen and they took data on it. What the system that they used looked like was different for everybody. 20% used like a specific checklist that they had made or that was specific to the client. 19% of them used a generic checklist, and then everybody else used some other idiosyncratic thing that was either existing or non-existing and had a bunch of varied names. And they give a bunch of examples in the article of like what different procedural fidelity data sheets could look like, which is kind of cool if you are not sure where to start. Then they ask them, when do you take procedural fidelity data if you do? 65% of them said they did during behavior change programs, either for increase or decrease. So that's like the biggest portion, which is what you would expect. 13% said they did during staff training. 12% said they did during assessments, and 8% during telehealth. So that's that breakdown. And then they said, how often do you take procedural fidelity data? 65% said they did it in less than 20% of supervision sessions, which, right, but how much less we don't necessarily know, because 20% would be like one out of every 5 times that you see someone, you take data, which I don't think would be that terrible.
By less than 20, we meant 0.
That's the thing, right? Did they mean 0? And then 8% of people said they did it in more than 80% of supervision sessions. So how could you do that? Maybe Rob will touch on that.
You could lie in a survey.
You could, no. And then they said, okay, let's say that you've taken some procedural fidelity data. How are you going to use those data? And there were 3 main ways they use the data. They said 46% of them said they use it to provide feedback and training to staff. 34% said they use it to assess treatment effectiveness. And 17% said they need to collect it for insurance reasons. And so that's why they're using it. And then to cap it all off, they said, okay, when you're not collecting procedural fidelity data, are there reasons why? Are there barriers? So listeners out there may, what's the word? Associate with this. There we go. Because sure, there are a lot of barriers out there, right? It's one more thing that you're being asked to do. And we already know everybody's got a really full plate. So you could probably imagine what these barriers are, but I'll tell you anyway. 29% said they don't have enough resources, meaning equipment, staff, or time to be able to do this. 13% said, although this sounds almost the same to me, that they had limited supervision time because their caseloads were too heavy in order to really do this. To me, there's overlap between those 2 categories, but that's okay. And then 20% said it's not required in their workplace, so they don't do it. Only 1% said that the reason why they didn't collect the data was that they were not useful. So that's not the reason. It's these other things that are probably getting in the way. All right.
That was the trick answer. They're like, no one's going to answer that because that's the wrong answer on the survey.
That would be none of the above.
Whoopsie doodle, we found you.
Okay, so that's like the lay of the land, right? So people supposedly know how to collect the data. They have systems either in place or they could make their own systems, but they're not doing it a ton of the time, probably less than 20% of the time if it is happening. And there are many barriers to why they might not be collecting it if they're not, which mostly have to do with time.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take a short break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about some articles related to using and setting up procedural fidelity systems. We'll be right back.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA? Also known as a board-certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
And we are back talking tutorials on procedural integrity. But before we continue with the conversation, I want to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QAVA approved. And by listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then click the link in your podcast player or on the webpage, wherever you are, and find a link to our website. It'll be there. It'll take you right there. And then put in some key information, including secret code words. Here's our first one. It's lime, L-I-M-E. It is a citrus fruit. It's green. You put it in all sorts of drinks. You could eat it, keep scurvy away. A lot of great reasons to have a lime.
Put it in the coconut.
You could do that as well. Lots of tropical drinks, use limes. Jackie's got a lime, what is that, a spindrift?
You know it.
All right. Don't say how good or bad it is, because they're not paying us to hark on their products. Hawk. Any of these things. Lime. All right. So now we are back. We're going to talk about Morris et al.'s Practitioner's Guide to Measuring Procedural Fidelity. And I hope many of you, when you hear this article, go look at this article, maybe print out some of the checklists, some of the examples. I'm going to give you a word picture, but sometimes a table is much better to see than it is to hear about. We'll try to be specific here. But this definitely is one of those great articles that, kind of like we said at the top, there's nothing in here that is like, no one has ever thought of these things. It just really takes a lot of what you probably remember from grad school, what you probably know as a professional, what you probably wish you did more of, looking at you, 20% or less folks, and puts it into a really digestible package that gives you ideas to do things better, as well as takes what you already are doing well and makes it even better than that. So kudos, Cody and team. I think that's most of the articles Cody writes. So they're just really great kind of additions to your own personal learning canon. So hooray. So thank you for that. So we already talked about the importance of procedural fidelity. So how are we going to get around some of these problems? So rather than identifying any one problem, we're just going to go through the steps that Cody and his team lay out. And then we'll talk sort of about which ones are probably more or less salient, depending on where you work, what your level of training is or is not. But this is going to assume that you want to do procedural fidelity data, take procedural fidelity data much more consistently, and that you believe the best way to do this is through direct observation. You certainly could do a lot of self-reflection sheets or Likert scales about how well do you like the treatment? Is it easy to use, right? And it's not that any of these are bad. However, none of them are going to capture the key components of the treatment that you are implementing and that your staff that you work with are implementing. So without that direct observation, you're really counting on a lot of just sort of survey data, which can be helpful, but is probably not going to give you the information you need. There's a lot of room for error or misunderstanding. So we're assuming you say, I want to directly observe my staff running treatments more, or I want to directly observe people using the treatments I recommended more consistently. How would I do that? All right, so that's the goal of this article. If you're like, I hate direct observation and I'll never do it again, this article is not for you. But I would also say this field is probably not for you because direct observation is like our thing. So here we go. It can often be very hard also to do procedural fidelity because we write so many individualized plans. However, I would say that if you've written enough plans, there are probably enough components that are based in evidence-based practice that you can pull a few stock pieces and then individualize your procedural fidelity forms. So the more you do this step, I think the easier and faster it will be to make new procedural fidelity forms. But a one-size-fits-all is going to rarely make sense for your clients and for the goal of procedural fidelity, which is ensuring no errors of commission, no errors of omission in the use of these plans. There are 6 steps that the Morris et al. Describe. Number 1, do a task analysis of your treatment procedures and break it down into measurable units. Number 2, assign relevant measures to each treatment component. Number 3, plan how you will do a direct observation to use this fancy checklist you put together. Number 4, use the procedural fidelity checklist to collect data. That one kind of goes with number 3, but 6 is a better number. Actually, 5 would be pretty good too. Oh well. And then 5, analyze and interpret the data that is collected. You got to do something with that data, right? And then number 6, take action. So look at your data, and depending on what data are collected, you will continue to improve procedural fidelity through more training, through updating your procedures. All right, so those are 6 steps. We're going to go through them in a little more depth. Pre-step 1 that the authors write out is you should make sure that you have an appropriate and evidence-based treatment. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a treatment that you know is effective at increasing or decreasing whatever the target at play is for your client, because again, you're often not going to have the ability to always do an experimental test of every treatment before putting together procedural fidelity. And frankly, even if you could, you'd still need a procedural fidelity checklist for those like small chunks of time. I know sometimes with treatments, if it's something that's a little bit more intense or there's more room for error and that could result in potential for harm, I like to do smaller chunks where I'm doing tons of direct observation with a very tight procedural fidelity checklist, but I still have to have the checklist before I can say this was or was not a good treatment. So I think what the authors are looking at is you just have to say, this is a good treatment. Like if you're looking at your treatment, you're like, I think there's a bad treatment. Don't bother writing a checklist. Come up with a better treatment. So again, you're assuming that this is an evidence-based treatment that you've put in play and that it is appropriate for the situation at hand. And now you're just going to be looking at the supervision of the continued usage of that plan correctly. Makes sense? Let's move on to actual step 1. First is go through your plan. I love this step because it's something I think a lot of us forget to do because we're like, I wrote a great plan. It's done. Hooray. Evidence-based. It's going to be great. And then you sort of slap it in a Word document or a Google Doc and you share it with everybody and say, on to the next plan. Do my thing. It's going to be awesome, right? However, do we always go through and make sure that we have a technologically written plan that someone with, qualifications in using these types of plans would be able to implement? Are we sure what training people have? I know for folks who work in schools, the amount of training that teachers get and how to use any sort of, behavior analytic or behavior change procedure is very limited. So depending on who you're working with, they could have a ton of training and supervision in that area. They could have almost no training or supervision in that area. So you really need to know not only your client, but who will be implementing this treatment when you're putting these in place. So you're going to go through and you might even ask a colleague, or you might ask someone with similar amount of training, hey, could you take a look at this? Does this make sense? What do you think it would look like if you're not too sure? But somebody who is relatively qualified to use the treatment components you're describing would be able to implement the plan as you intend. Again, everything needs to be described behaviorally and objectively. Everything needs to be described completely. You need to be thinking of all components. So a lot of times that means you're going to have these sort of sequential and conditionally based instructions. So if this happens, do these steps. So that's the conditional and then the sequential. Then you go back, but if this happens, do these steps, right? Because student could either use the functional communication or student could engage in aggressive behavior, right? So you sort of have these nested lists that are organized both conditionally and sequentially. When this happens, you should do this, and here are the steps in the order in which you will do them. And even within those nested tables, you might have double or triple or quadruple nested tables. If you're doing FCR, if the student uses this type of FCR, here are the steps. But if they slightly change it, you might also add these, so you could have these like very complicated steps. As long as they read understandably, so someone, if they were following it, kind of act it out, you're probably okay. Though again, this is a good time to double check how much of these components are actually behaviorally and objectively written. You'll always find a few that perhaps are not. How many of them are not clear about context in which you should do problems, probably step A versus step B, right? You might want to rethink it. And you sort of want to start using this time also to chunk your plan into kind of relevant contexts. I certainly see these sometimes where I see these like elaborate plans where there's like 1,000 steps and they're all sort of treated like, and you'll do all of these steps at one. Whereas in reality, like you're only going to do steps 1 and 2 when you're in the cafeteria, and steps 3 and 4 when you're doing, skill acquisition programming, right? You're not going to use everything all the time. So this is a good time to sort of start thinking about how will these be chunked. This is also going to come in handy later when we talk about observations. Okay. So you've already got all your treatment components into these nice organized chunks. You have these different levels based on sequences, based on the conditional requirements of using the plan. You've got these great headers that sort of explain what it is each section is talking about in general. So it could look something like at mealtime. And then within at mealtime, you have like while eating food, and then another heading when aggressive behavior occurs, right? If you're working on, say, a mealtime program. Then you could also have, within that other steps, inform the client that their timer is starting, inform the client that their break card is available, right? The different steps you might use in that chunk of time. And again, you're going to have one giant document when this is all done. And you've made a nice procedural fidelity checklist when this is all finished. So if anyone read this, they could sort of act it out. Oh, it looks like this. I'd do this if they did this, and this is what it would look like. Sometimes people say, well, can't I just write out like a whole big block of all the steps they need to do? And one of the challenges here is that if you're trying to do something that is readable, that might be okay. But if you're trying to write it out so that you can also take procedural fidelity data on what you're observing, big block of actions, it's just taking all of the components of a plan and sort of smushing it into a giant yes to the whole thing or no to the whole thing. Which again, isn't the worst procedural fidelity check you could do. The worst would be you don't do it at all, right? However, if the answer is no, okay, well, what part is no? The whole thing? They just didn't do any of these things? So it's really not as useful information. Now, if you're lucky and you're working with like the best staff in the world, they get a plan and they run it perfectly every time. Yes, no, with a big block of text, maybe it's appropriate in this very magical unicorn situation. But come on, folks, we don't have too many of those. Everybody makes mistakes on a plan, especially in the early stages. So it's just not going to be what you need. You're going to have to break it out into lots and lots and lots of individual steps. And this is a great time also to be thinking about, do I have steps that are just huge chunks of text that I really should break down further because nobody could read this and know what to do? So again, great time to be thinking about how you write out your plan. Great time to think about what your plan should look like. Great job to make sure you have everything written behaviorally and objectively. Excellent. There we go. Also a great time to think about how subjective some of your terms might be. So if you're writing something, I love Morris et al.'s example here. If you're writing like, approach the student respectfully. What does that mean? What does that look like? With a bow tie on? Should I be in formal wear? I don't know. So when you have those situations where you're just not quite sure how to objectively write something that is pretty subjective, step 1 is going to be look at literature. Is there anything in Java recently that talks about respectful behavior or respectful treatment of clients or compassionate care of clients? We're seeing more and more of those articles every day. Something in BAP maybe, right? Behavioral interventions. If you don't have an example that you can directly pull from, again, that's when you put on your acting cap and think, what do I want this to look like? So when you think of respectfully, well, I want them to use words like please or thank you. Okay, there you go. That's what you mean. It's not approach them respectfully. It's to approach them and say, excuse me, name of client. Aiden is the one they use throughout this study. Excuse me, Aiden. And stand.
I said good day.
Yeah.
I said good day.
So approach with a respectful salutation is how they wrote it in Morris. So they've got all sorts of examples that you can use, but I've given you some already. And the article, again, this is one where they have lots of great tables to go through as more and more examples. So again, you've gone through this process. You've got a checklist from the heavens. It's amazing. Step 2, and I love step 2. This is the extra percent that I feel like I said to myself, this makes perfect sense. I don't know why I don't do this all the time, which is now that you have your checklist, what is the relevant measure you are looking for each treatment component? And if you're like me and most of these checklists are sort of check done or X not done, this is really where you can up your procedural fidelity game. So even if you're in that group that, 80% or more of the time you're doing procedural fidelity? Are you taking procedural fidelity data that is measurable beyond just that dichotomy, yes, happened, no, didn't happen? And if not, well, here's a chance to up your game a little more. There's a relevant dimension for every component of your treatment plan, right? It's not always just whether it did or did not happen. It might need to happen at a certain rate. It might need to happen with a certain response time or latency, right? So these are the chances you can collect that meaningful data, because it's more than just, did you do a plan, yes or no? It really is, did you do a plan to the extent required for the plan to be effective? So here we think about our 3 dimensions of measurement. All right, is this a measure of repeatability, a measure of temporal extent, or a measure of temporal locus? So repeatability means we're counting some instance of behavior. This is where you're looking at rates, your frequency counts, right? Temporal extent, again, the total amount of time a behavior occurs. That could be a duration of a component of a plan. And then your temporal locus is going to be the time between a behavior and another event. So either the individual's own behavior, which would be looking at latency, or your behavior or your response to something could also be latency. It could be in a response time as well. So again, you're looking
That's
at...
right. Test takers, listen up. That was good stuff.
Thank you. All right, so you're looking at those components. So what is the relevant measurement for each step of the checklist? And I know you might be saying, that sounds like a lot of work. I have done this. I had to update. We're doing a lot of work on our systems at my day job. And one of our steps was, okay, we need to be talking about how we do procedural fidelity. And it was a perfect time for this article because I said, I got to rewrite this plan anyway. I'm going to do the full checklist. I will be honest. It definitely took a little bit of extra time to add this step in. But when it was done, I have a checklist that is going to make for amazing observations. I've used it once and I liked it already. We didn't get to go through the whole thing because, again, a lot of conditional components of a plan. So every piece should have a relevant and potentially different measurement. Not necessarily all of them. There will still probably be a lot of yes, no's in your plan, but you should have a lot of relevant measurement for the different components. Because, again, you want to compare the components apples to apples in your analysis of how the plan is being used. So again, some things are going to be these dichotomous yes, no, or they either did it perfectly or, it was either 0, they didn't do it, or 100, they did it correctly, right? So when you have those, you sort of take your observed value and divide it by the attended value if you're looking to make sure that there aren't any omission errors, so people forgetting to do things. If you're looking at commission errors, so people are adding to the plan things that shouldn't be there, again, same idea. At the end of this, dichotomous measure, whatever you have, you'll have your intended value. So how many times should they have done whatever that component is, divided by the observed value, multiplied by 100, bam, you get your kind of procedural fidelity percentage. If there are extra things that happen that shouldn't have happened, great. You don't need to write those in a checklist. They shouldn't have happened. Just make a note of them. So when you're giving feedback to your staff member or to the teacher, whoever you're working with, then you can just sort of refer to those pieces specifically. Each component, each measurement should be right next to the corresponding treatment component. So you've got this great, hey, if the step is something about, if student, says, I don't want to eat, how long before you prompt them to use their, I'd like a break card, right? If it's 5 seconds, okay, great. Right next to that step in your plan should be, a space to write a number and then a slash and then 5 seconds as a nice reminder, too, of how long you have. Did the person take 10 seconds? Okay, great. You write 10 out of 5, then you get the fact they took, that person, they took 100% longer than they should have to complete that component of the plan. Or they didn't do it at all. 0% correct.
One thing I like about this, too, is that if you do this and share it with your staff, it just provides another way for them to contact, not just the technology of ABA, but the language of ABA and why we're doing something and how we're doing something. And so, no one ever talks about those dimensions unless they're studying for the BACB exam, right? So I think that's something that would be really good for it would be good for you, right? Because you know exactly what you're studying. But then it would also be good for those new staff to contact that language, not just in class, but also in their clinical work as well, which is where it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say something similar too, which is the process of doing this is going to result in a very detailed, basically step-by-step guide for your staff on what it is that they need to do on the floor. And that in and of itself could change a lot, right? Because sometimes we're like, run this program. You know how to do it. Just go do it, right? And you don't get this level of breakdown. So that providing them with basically like these very detailed instructions could have a big change on the procedural fidelity, independent of how much you're taking the data, right? And providing feedback on like, oh, you only got 60% this time, right? That part may be secondary to just giving them this level of detail for what their job actually should be.
Mm-hmm. Another component that you can add in your measurement is if you're observing something that could happen multiple times within your observation, so kind of lots of spot checks, or one component could happen many, many times, you can sort of just put lots of little spaces for how many times it could have happened. And then you can convert that to kind of a specific count measure that captures, the total correct number of responses and opportunities. So, hey, even though this could have happened once, there were actually 10 opportunities to engage in this prompting response. And each time they did it. So out of those 10, there were 10 opportunities, 100% correct, usage of this component of the plan. So some examples that they give it's in table 3. If you're reading along with the article, you could have a different step. Some of them are going to be yes, no. So for example, set a timer for 15 minutes. You either did or did not set that timer. It's not like, well, I set it for 13 minutes. No, you didn't set it for 15. It's no. So some of those are going to have those dichotomous yes or no. So the score is either 0 or 100 on that step. But you could have something like provide intermittent encouragement to Aiden, who's the phantom participant in this article, at least 5 times throughout the interval. So you'd have a space to tally how many intermittent encouraging statements were there, and then a /5 as a reminder that there need to be at least 5. So you have a component score column that's going to be however many times you observe that intermittent encouragement, divided by 5. So ideally it would be 5. That might be one too, or if we're 7 or 8, is that a problem or is it not a problem? Usually extra praise isn't a problem, but maybe it is in this case, right? But now you have a sense of, is it happening at the rate that needs to happen? A step like withhold reinforcement following problem behavior. You'd have a measurement of, how many times correct / number of opportunities total. So that would be a place you'd have to write 2 numbers, because again, there might not be any problem behavior, in which case you didn't observe that occurring because it didn't need to happen. But if there was 2 instances of problem behavior, were there also 2 times where the staff withheld reinforcement for the problem behavior, right? And then you could get a percentage of correct implementation. A step like redirect Aiden within 15 seconds of the behavior beginning. Again, you'd have a space to write down how long, what was the latency to the staff redirection, and then a /15 seconds. Again, so now you can calculate what's the amount of time it took divided by the maximal allowed latency. Because again, it could be less. Like it's not like you have to wait exactly 15 seconds. It just can't be more than 15 seconds, or shouldn't be more. Some step like give a 3 to 4 minute break after some task, right? You'd have a space to write how many seconds was the break /180 seconds, right? Because again, you could go a little bit over that, but it really should be about a 3-minute break. And then a step like provide attention every 30 seconds on average. You'd have lots of little spaces /30 seconds to write down every 30-second interval, because I'm guessing you're not just observing for 30 seconds. You're probably observing for 5 to 15 minutes, more likely 10 to 15 minutes, right? So you have lots of opportunities to note, hey, every 30 seconds, this behavior did occur. The staff did provide some amount of attention over 30 seconds, right? And then you'd even have a space for an average IRT. So if it says around 30 seconds, so there's some room for variability, you could just write down what was kind of the inner response time between all of these positive attention statements or eye contact, whatever the form of the attention took. And then you can average it out. Did it come out to about 30 seconds between each one on average? If so, this part of the plan has been implemented correctly. So again, a lot of examples in the article, a lot of examples of filled out forms. So if you want more information on the measurement, which I think is probably the coolest component of this article, take a look at the article. So now step 3, plan the direct observations. This isn't something that's very hard, because if you've written a very good plan, a very good treatment checklist, and you've looked at all the measurements, it's just a matter of doing something that you've been trained to do and you've done a million times before. However, one of the components that is going to be key here is, are you meeting your ethical obligation to take data on the implementation of your treatment plans? Are you ensuring that an effective plan is in place? And Morris et al. Argue that if you don't know if your plan is actually in place, it by definition cannot be considered effective.
Right.
So if you have no idea if the effective plan is going on the way it's supposed to be, you might as well have not made a plan. And if you start there as it's my ethical responsibility to make sure my plan is effectively being used, it makes it a little easier to sort of kick yourself in the pants and say, I got to get those direct observations. And even if I can't bill it in insurance, even if I don't have the resources, because if you're starting from this is a problem I need to solve, you're going to be much more likely to come up with a meaningful solution that works for you in your work context. All right. So start there. If you're like, I don't care if it's effective or not, that's not ethical, but I'm probably not going to convince you should be doing more direct observation and using these checklists already. So we've got a different problem.
I can basically hear Cody saying that as a statement, right? Like, if you don't know if your plan is in place, your plan is not in place.
All right. So now we have to think, all right, it is hard to do this many direct observations. So you do need to think about how you can make this efficient. And this might mean you have to prioritize. So you've got a plan that's got 10 different components, but the one that's most important has to do with maybe safety or maybe a skill acquisition. So if you can't watch every aspect of the plan in the time you would want to, okay, fine. Prioritize certain components. You know exactly what they should look like. And then pick the meaningful times for observation. I feel like I remember the first time a supervisor, when I was studying, when I was getting ready for the BCBA exam, told me you should observe when you know the behavior of note is going to happen. It was like, wow, really? I don't just show up and I'm like, man, I hope they're doing the thing I need to see today. Because guess what? They never will be. It's always going to be somebody's birthday party or fun field trip day and no one's there. It's snack. Somebody's sick. The staff are out. Right? You're never going to observe. If you just show up, forget it. Assume nothing of interest will happen. It's nap time, right? So only go observe at the time you know the behavior of note that you need to observe is happening. And if you're not sure, then you make sure you work with the staff, you make sure you work with the teacher for it to happen. And that might mean just begging, like, please, could you just make sure I could come at 1 today? Could you make sure that's math time or snack time today? Could you just push it a little bit? Most people will be like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. But they just need to know that it needs to happen that way. Most people are pretty flexible in that regard. And if they're like, no, we can never change it. Okay, then you just need to shift your schedule around at least once that week, right? Which could be hard. You need to pick a relevant length of observation. So again, if you're only looking at one component of a plan, you might only need 5 minutes. I would recommend trying to see 2 or 3 components and going at least 15 minutes for an observation. That tends to be sort of a nice magic number. If you're regularly doing these observations, 15 usually will get the job done.
It's also the length of a contact.
There you go.
That 2022 fieldwork requirements. So 15 minutes is key.
But again, if you know that you need to observe 40 minutes of a lesson because your plan has some sort of component that says this has got to happen for a full 40 minutes. All right, it's 40 minutes. Maybe you didn't need that part of the plan. I don't know. That might be a question to ask yourself. But you need to go at the times that matter to say, I collected data on procedural fidelity. And when I'm looking at the results of the treatment implementation, I know if there's no change, or I know if there is change, it's because of it isn't, or it is because of this plan. Like, it's not a component of failure of the plan being implemented. Again, looking for the naturalistic times, you might need to contrive a situation. Again, I do this a lot with trainees of like, I need to see 3 plans. I can come for 30 minutes. Is there a way that we could just run these 3 components of the plan? And if the answer is no, we cannot, okay, then we need to have a discussion about, how long this might take. We need to have a discussion about what's the key component that has to be seen, because if it's not being done correctly, you can't wait another week, right? Or we need to be saying, maybe this plan isn't an appropriate plan for the context we're in. Morris, I'll give a nice example of if you're noticing that you can't ever observe this like 15-minute DRO because of how the classroom is run, that things keep changing every 15 minutes. So staff just really never have the time to implement it. All right, you need to change your plan because it's not going to work in the environment in which you assumed it would be effective. Also, if you're never sure or you don't know how often you need to observe, ask yourself the question, how much supervision is my minimally accepted guideline for RBTs, for BEC ABAs, and use that as a starting point. Your 5% ups or your 2 to 5%, your 5 to 10%, depending on your supervision periods. Use that as your starting point if you're not quite sure how to math it out. Another thing you can think of is how good is your staff? If you've already done 2 observations within the past week and they nailed the procedural fidelity check, maybe you only need to observe the newer parts of the plan. Maybe you only need to observe them once every other week doing these components of the plan because you're not worried about the procedural fidelity of the plan. Maybe this is a staff who's had a long history of struggling with new plans and you're going to need to observe every day temporarily until you see some criterion of success in your procedural fidelity with that staff member. But again, one thing you want to keep in mind is just because the staff can engage in your plan with good procedural fidelity is not the same as now you never need to observe them again, because there's a lot of rapport building that you can do during these observations. I still remember I had a staff member that I almost never observed because the times I'd observed them, they were amazing. They were so good. And then we got to the end of the school year, and some of the feedback I got was, that staff member felt like you didn't like them at all because you never went to watch them. And I looked at my supervisor and said, no, they're amazing. I never had to watch them because I knew they were so good. And I never even thought they might take that as a sign that I didn't think they were any good at their job. And they weren't worth my time. And I felt so terrible about it. I've never forgotten that. And that was, God, how old that was. It's almost like 17 years ago I had that feedback. I still remember how awful I felt at really letting down that supervisee. So I always make a point.
That teacher's pet supervisee.
Yeah, I know. By trying to signal how amazing this person was, I thought they sucked, which, oh my God. So don't make the same mistake I did. Don't do what Donnie Don't does in that regard. So no matter how perfect they are, you want to do your procedural fidelity checks. All right. When you're doing...
And give them a project to do.
Yeah, give them special projects as rewards. When you're taking data, again, you're taking data. That should be pretty easy. However, you do want to think of a few things, and Morris et al. Bring up a couple steps that are recommended by Reed et al. Of you want to monitor frequently enough so that staff get used to your being there, so there's no reactivity. You want to monitor immediately when you enter the staff workplace so people don't see you as a cue of, I better do my job, and then when they leave, I won't do my job anymore. You might do an unexpected return monitoring session. So like, boom, pop quiz, I'm here to watch you. And you thought I was done because I saw you yesterday. And you sort of want to be generally unpredictable as a schedule. So there's no novelty of when you're there, do your job, when you're not there. Now, again, even Reed, when giving these suggestions, says take these with a grain of salt, because if you're constantly pop quizzing your staff, the message they get is you think they're bad and lazy and you have to check on them all the time. They need, mommy and daddy to watch them, which may not be the case. So you also aren't necessarily following a lot of the social norms of saying hello to people or letting them know what it is you're going to be observing, which a lot of research on consulting says kind of endears you to the people that you were observing. So if you're just showing up and you're like, I'm all business watching you, get started, you're probably making people not like seeing you as much. And if you're doing enough of these observations, you want them to be a positive experience where staff are excited to get your feedback, excited to hear how well they've done. So take that with a grain of salt. If you want to have some unpredictability, you might tell the staff that as this is just something I'm doing so it doesn't become too expected. Or you might just make up a cover story of like, oh, I forgot to check this the other day. Sorry, I didn't let you know ahead of time, right? So it doesn't feel like you're trying to be unpredictable to mess with them, even though that might be what you're doing. So again, some thoughts to take into account. Then you analyze your data. Again, doing your individual measurement is going to let you analyze your plan and the procedural fidelity of that plan so much better because you will be able to know exactly what is or is not occurring at the level it needs to be for the plan to be effective. And then take any action you need to improve procedural fidelity. If staff are struggling in one step, ask yourself, is this a training issue or is it a fact that I made this plan too complicated or it's not clear enough? Or is it that the plan is not going to work in the environment I put it in, right? You use that data just like you would for anything else. Again, Morris et al. Say, we love these steps, and I love these steps. However, there's nothing about these steps that is prescriptive. It's not like if you don't follow these, you're bad at procedural fidelity. These are just really strong recommendations. And there's also not necessarily research on every single one of these components to say, and if you do these, you'll never have a problem with procedural fidelity or crummy results of your treatments again, because some of these components are more like professionally guided suggestions. Some of them are based in a little more research, but it's not like the package as a whole is. However, as someone who's been doing this a long time, I think we would all agree that these are really awesome steps to be starting with. And especially if you're not, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you probably know we've talked about steps 1, 4, 5, and 6 as components of training, as good components of BST, as good components of analyzing your treatment. But I think like steps 2 and 3, especially in this article, really break down some next level ways to get meaningful procedural fidelity data. And also reminding you, if you want to do good procedural fidelity observations, you have to plan ahead and you have to make that something that you prioritize. Put it in your schedule. Don't make it something that you may or may not do. It drives me nuts when folks like blow me off for things because they're like, well, some other thing came up. And I'm like, no, at some point, you've made it to the big time of being a big behavior analyst who cares about their job, when you're comfortable telling people, no, I cannot schedule something at this time because I have to do these other components of my job. And until you get there, you're probably not doing the best job you can, nor are people taking your responsibilities very seriously. And I don't think you're taking yourself very seriously as a professional. So again, that's my thought.
Complex.
I understand.
Thing
at some point you should feel good enough to say no. That's how you know you've made it, when you feel comfortable saying no and here's why and it's fair, and that you can say it in a way that doesn't make people mad at you.
Okay, just saying, not everyone is in the same position to be able to say no in their job.
But someday they will be. I'm not saying you should do that right off the bat, but at some point be thinking about the day when you can say no comfortably.
I applaud that you are acting in the best interest of your clients.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right.
Okay. Jackie, what can we take away from your Al Nasser et al. Article on how you actually can implement procedural fidelity?
So with this article, they really were looking at how to make it easier for staff to do things, right? And one thing they noted is, yep, BST is great, but we can't necessarily always do BST because it's costly. It's, it takes a lot of time. Maybe we don't have that. And so they really wanted to replicate the Grafton-Karsten article of 2012, but in a more clinical way.
Article.
Yeah, we talked about that, I think, at some point. And I love this article. Yeah, so they looked at self-instruction manuals, just like the standard manual, where you basically just have all of our technical jargon and it's just written out and there's nothing there. And they're like, here, read this and then do it, right? Or they wanted to look at whether in a clinical way, because I love that they put this because I was wondering it too. They used an A/B design across participants. And I was like, well, they're not really demonstrating functional control. And they pointed it out that they're not demonstrating functional control because that's not the point. The point is to see what happens clinically.
Knew you were reading this article, Chad. Like, yeah, I don't even care. We don't even care, Jackie. In your face.
We already saw that it can demonstrate functional control with this previous article. So that's not the purpose. So I love that they put that in there.
Very bold of them.
Very bold, right? And so
why not just stagger some baselines and stack them up, and then you get a multiple baseline.
In your face, Diana. That's not the point. These authors know what's what.
So they're looking at these enhanced self-instruction manuals. And so the enhanced manuals really just break things down in really easy to understand language. They may use step-by-step. They may use pictures. They may use videos, right? So, but they have it's easier to read, right? And it's easier to understand, and there's pictures. And so they wanted to say, okay, who will do better on these tasks? So they had 14 students or graduate students that worked on this that had never run preference assessments or these motor imitation or discrete trials. So they had multiple tasks, and they wanted to look at, whose fidelity on these assessments based on using their whatever instruction manual that they were using would be better. And what killed me is that this whole entire study for each participant only took an hour, right? The participants come in, they're like, read this manual. Okay, do this. And then they had the two other tasks, read this manual, manual, then do this. And then they were done. Right?
Love it.
And that's amazing. And they do say that they couldn't ask any questions when they began, right? And they were not given any feedback on how they were doing. So that's key to this, right? Because their rationale was that the staff likely will not have the supervisor there while they're implementing whatever they're doing, right? So we have to look on the manuals alone. And so, they were given 30 minutes to look at it, run through it, and then they ran through two different preference assessments in discrete trial task, a matching to sample task, and motor imitation with a confederate. And they looked to see how they did. And 7 or 8 of the participants had the standard instruction manual first, and then for 2 of the tasks, and then they had the enhanced manual, and then they flipped it for the other one. So they had enhanced manual for 6 of the participants first, and then they had the standard manual. And really what they said was that the standard manual kind of sucked in a way, right? Like it didn't show great performance. Only 29.
It's a quote from the article. This kind of sucked.
Yeah, they said that. Yep, that was how they ended it. In the discussion, they're like, the standard manual kind of sucked. Only 29% of the participants endorsed the language in the standard manual, whereas like over 80, I think it was like 80 to 90% endorsed the enhanced manual. And the performance actually really speaks for itself, right? So they're looking at procedural fidelity of these different things. And when you had the standard manual, you really had 0 to 73% initially correct. So someone did well, but someone did very bad, right? But with the enhanced, it was all the way up from 68% to 95%. Again, this is without feedback, just looking at the manual. And they showed that the people that had the standard manual first did better when they got the enhanced manual, and that the people that got the enhanced manual first didn't increase their scores because they were already high when they got the standard instruction. And so I think this really goes to, when you are making treatments, make them easy to understand for staff, break them down for them. And then if you break them down for them, you can also use that breakdown as your procedural fidelity sheet, your data sheet, right? You can just if it's easy to understand for them, it's going to be easier to understand for you to see if they've done it or not. They did note that the one part was not uniformly great across it. They said that the prompting, specifically gestural prompting, was not consistent, that there was some lower performance there. And they said that there were still errors, right? It's not 100%, but it is much better. So this is one way that we can improve overall performance on specific tasks, is by using these enhanced instructions. Yeah,
love it.
Without feedback, right? So that's
so like maybe the gestural prompting is the one thing in this that would then need the BST.
Right, that would then need more supervision oversight.
Yeah.
Right. But I just love that. So I think it's a nice way to show staff what they're doing and know that they're likely going to do it better and like it better.
I know one thing that I was a little not disappointed exactly, but I really would have loved more information. And again, some of there's just not a lot.
This was a brief report.
No, I know. And there's not a lot of research on this area specifically, but I'd love, again, more complex skills. Because I think one of the reasons we love starting with some of the skills in the article are because they're relatively straightforward. I would love a little bit more detail as to exactly what goes into the enhanced versus non-enhanced.
So what they did
manuals.
Say there is that you need to go back and refer to the Grafton and Karsten article of 2012. So they're like, they did an amazing job in the introduction. They're like, they did an amazing job describing it. So if you want that information, go there, because it was a brief report. So they do give it to you. You just didn't go and look, Rob.
Well, I'm not going to go. I don't want to go back. I'm reading 2 articles already. I don't got time for this.
That's on you, Rob. That's on you. Set on the author.
Yeah. All right.
It's mostly pictorial displays.
But I'd love to see more examples of those with more complex skills. And also, what do you need to do? Or like, who are the types of people who would be able to create these? Because I play a lot of games. We play a lot of board games, which means I read a lot of instructions. And I usually am the one who has to teach the instructions. And people whose like jobs it is, like your one job is to make a game and then make a list of how to play your game, tend to write bad instruction books. So I'm guessing people who it's like, my job is to write good instruction books about how to play these like games. I made up the game too, saying, I don't think it's a skill that everyone necessarily can do. So what would go into a good one versus not? Like, is this the kind of thing that we're like, there's not a lot of research because we're hoping somebody publishes the great book of enhanced SI manuals?
So we're going into dissemination station, I think. Here we go.
Okay.
Right, because we're hitting time. I think I think that as a supervisor, that should be part of your training. Like, how do you develop good procedural integrity checklists or data sheets?
Yeah.
And also then how do you train your staff appropriately? Right? Because there hasn't been
listen to this podcast.
Yeah, I was gonna say our dissemination station is like, go listen to the episode again. We said it all.
And go
it's
check
all
out
there.
the articles and all the examples.
Yeah. Right. And then do it.
And all three of these articles give you examples.
Yeah. Do it, and then we can talk about it, right? But there isn't like a ton of research on this, but there's more than I thought, right? But I think you just need to do it, right? Do it, and then have your supervisor do it, and then ask your staff. Be open and honest and communicative with your staff. Like, how did I do? Can you replicate this? Can you do what I'm asking you to do? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? What do you not understand? And then review it.
I think that is very true for the procedural fidelity checks. I think when we're talking about these enhanced manuals to improve overall fidelity of all programs, that does feel like it is either going to happen from a more centralized group or it is not going to happen. Because I think it's a big difference between I have a lot of my own bespoke materials that I use with supervisees and trainees over the years that I've sort of iterated on, but not everyone's going to have the time to do that. And it's hard, I think, it's hard to say any one BCBA or one clinician should be responsible for that job. Like if you're in an organization, someone in the organization, that probably could be a full-time job. It's like, how do we train? How do we get these manuals? Because once you have it, it's made, then you iterate on it. But it's getting it in the first place.
That's a training department issue. That's what training department.
But if you don't have a training department, it's also hard to say, don't worry about it. Someone else will do this training because you're sort of still stuck. So it may be a matter of, if you don't have a training department, focus on the individualized procedural fidelity piece. And then as you start getting patterns of, man, I made this checklist like 50 times. Great. Okay, maybe you can make your enhanced SI book using some of those materials. Yeah. And in 50 years, you'll have it all done.
That's a great idea.
That is a great idea,
I think we as a field don't necessarily learn how to use our stuff.
And because, people learn in different ways too, right? So for some people, just the written instructions is fine. Some people, they definitely want the pictorially enhanced instructions. For some people, a video would be better and do it video modeling style. And then for others, maybe it does need to be BST, even though that's more labor intensive. So having something that exists that kind of like moves you through these either in a sequential order or based on some initial feedback from the person that you're trying to train on what way they think they learn best, or what you've discerned that they learn best, and then from there having different models set up with commonly occurring behaviors that we use to train would be great. And that wouldn't have to be specific to the place that you work. Someone should make this.
Yeah. So
did I make sense there?
I think so.
Okay.
So bad news, you got to do more procedural fidelity checks than you're doing. Good news, you've got a number of easy to follow steps that you can use now to make those procedural fidelity checks happen. And you also have the permission of Morris et al. You have our permission to say, this is an important component of effective treatment. I have to do this. And if you need help with scheduling that, talk to your supervisor, talk to your bosses about how to make this happen more consistently too. And they'll understand. I'm sure they will. If you say it somewhat like that, like we just said. Don't say I listened to a podcast and they said, unless they've heard of our podcast, in which case they might say, oh, them? Oh, well, then you definitely have to do it. Anyway.
Okay. Cool. We did it.
All right. Let's move into pairings.
All right. Hooray. It's time for pairings. Pairings is the part of the show where I tell you about past episodes in our episode library that you might want to go check out if you found this topic interesting.
I did.
Wonderful. Then the number one episode I would direct you to is our episode on procedural integrity that we did with Dr. Paula Braga-Kenyon. That was episode number 133.
It was her birthday. Happy birthday, Paula.
Oh, happy birthday. You also might want to check out our double episode, numbers 172 and 173, in which we talked about research to practice and then practice to research. Because what we're trying to do here is really think about how we can, take things to the floor and do a practical application of things that we, typically think about as research oriented. So check those out. I also think that several of our supervision episodes would be relevant here. The ones that are talking about how do we break down challenges that we see in training staff and how to approach that, as well as how we are going to give feedback to change behavior. So there's episode 215 where we discuss the PDCHS. That is a supervision episode. Episode 97 where we talk about staff feedback with Dr. Amy Henley, also a supervision episode. And then episode 184, where we talk about receiving feedback. That was with Tyra Sellers and Seth Walker as well. Part of pairings is also where I like to recommend a snack for you to enjoy while you're listening to these episodes. And so our snack today is a packet of digestibles. Because when Rouse said that, you were like, this is a great little packet of digestible information that just made me laugh because digestibles are like cookies. They're like, yeah, it's like a British term for it's a certain type of cookie, but they're kind of like a graham cracker type of cookie, and they're digestibles, right? Because graham crackers were originally like a health food. Did you know this as well?
Mr. Graham's crackers.
Yes, no, it's graham flour, and so they were thought to be like easy on the stomach, and so these are digestibles because they're, I believe, also made out of graham flour.
It sounds like some gut theory nonsense, Diana. I don't know.
Well, it's like 1800s stuff. So
I'm putting the 1800s on blast.
They're pretty good. They're pretty good. They come in like a tube, like a sleeve, and you can also get them with chocolate on the back, and those are probably the best.
Those are my
a packet of digestibles.
Is
what you can enjoy.
Yeah,
I used to
enjoy.
When I was in England, when I lived there for a bit, I would always go out to get my digestives. That's what they were called. Digestives.
Yes, they're digestives. Yes.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end. When we talk about Britain, we're talking about the end of the show. No, that's the end of the show because it's the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening. Patrons, thank you so much for voting on this. Don't forget to come back in the springtime. We'll be talking about a tutorial on token economies. So we'll be doing another one of these. Huzzah! But don't forget to check in your podcast player or on the video page for your code for a free CE. You put that in the discount code when you check out for the CE. Also, if you're interested in also getting a discount code, just join Patreon at the $5 up level. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. I want to we'll do thanks first today. We want to thank certainly all of you for listening, our patrons for voting on these topics. We want to thank Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturria for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. And finally, the ultimate thank you, the second secret code word, which is Grinch, Grinch. He's like a mean character who steals Christmas. He's a Grinchy guy made by Dr. Seuss.
Touch him with like a 39.5-foot pole.
No, then not that guy. Grinch. Anyway, we'll be back with another fun-filled episode next week. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.